After Nixon, Gerald Ford became president. Ford had the shortest term of all of them. He made his first bad move when he pardoned Nixon, even though Nixon had never been convicted of anything, but he issued a blanket pardon for Nixon for all of Nixon's crimes. Also, Ford, as soon as he became president, made all these trips that were supposedly political trips out of the country. He went everywhere all at once, and so much so that the next president, Jimmy Carter, said, if elected, I will not leave the country for a year. It was one of the few campaign promises that Carter made that he actually kept. But anyway, Ford made all these trips at taxpayer expense. They actually were vacation trips disguised as political trips. But anyway, after Ford, there was Carter. Carter is a native Georgian. Jimmy Carter was elected by the conservatives of this country, particularly, I must say, the Christian conservatives, who turned against him hard 4 years later. They wound up abandoning him and voting for a divorced Hollywood movie star. But anyway, he proved to be more liberal than any president we'd had up to that time. But we thought he'd be a conservative. It's like he stabbed us. After Carter, Reagan. He's the one who ran the big arms race against the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union could not afford. It helped collapse the Soviet Union. After Reagan, there was Bush, Clinton, another Bush. They were not the same, father and son. And finally, Obama. I do think it's important you know something about these. In my case, I lived through every one of them. Except I don't remember Truman as president. Under Carter, among other things, we had a big problem with inflation, which Reagan helped to bring under control. Under Clinton, he'll be remembered for his scandals, more so than the prosperity the country had. All right. Essentially, that's summing up recent American history in just a few minutes. Again, I'm emphasizing the presidents. The presidents who seem to have had the best time of it are the ones who didn't have to serve 2 terms. But folk had fought almost all of them to grief. And in the case of Reagan, his popularity remained up during the time he was in office, but he started suffering from Alzheimer's, we now know, while he was still in office. His mind started going, but that was, again, kept hush-hush and cover-up. If it had been known, his successor, George Bush, could have taken over and Reagan been retired, but they kept that quiet. His wife particularly covered up for him. All right, moving on to Canada. The only 2 things to remember about Canada. They're extremely socialistic. They became so really fast. But one difference between the United States and Canada and Europe. Right? There's Canada and Europe on one side. Canada and Europe became socialistic much faster than the United States did. The United States was able to hold back on it for a long time and moved toward it more slowly. Canada plunged headlong into it, and it's so bad in Canada, the health care is so bad, that the wealthier Canadians, when they get sick, will actually come to the United States because they get to see an American doctor. And many a Canadian who knows he probably has colorectal cancer will die waiting for an appointment to see his doctor. Today is April 21st. Supposing you were in Canada, you call the doctor, hey, I think I have colorectal cancer. Doctor, well, I have this opening in November. I'll put you down for November 15th, but if something comes up before then, I'll call you. Adios. And you might be dead before the doctor gets to see you. By the time the doctor gets to see you, you're so far gone, the doctor can't help you anymore. If any of you have heard any different about Canada's healthcare system, you're welcome. Your comments are welcome. But this is what I've heard from some of my students and Europe's in the same boat. Their doctors are overworked. Another bad thing about healthcare, their doctors do not make a lot of money. To keep the costs down, the government sets the limit on what a doctor can charge. Now in our country, doctors might work 84 hours a week, but at least they get a lot of money for that. But imagine a doctor working 84 hours a week and not being adequately recompensed for it. Basically, they have no incentive to keep working. The other thing when we remember about Canada is the province of Quebec. Quebec has been part of Canada since the French and Indian War, but they've been told they could still speak French, and that treaty, the Treaty of Paris of 1763, is still observed. They have never been forced to become Protestant, and they have never been forced to give up their native French language. The people of Quebec, by in very narrow margin, like 52 to 48%, voted to stay with Canada. But that's still a big issue. Some people in Quebec want to leave and others want to stay, and the rest of the Canadians really want them to stay. So that's one of their big issues. All right. Moving on from Canada to Latin America. The Great Depression of the 30s created a lot of political instability in Latin America, and Latin Americans typically went from one dictatorship to another. Now, I had a brother who taught school in Latin America in the 1970s, and he said one morning they all woke up. This was in Honduras, and there was a new government had taken over during the night. It was a bloodless coup, but the new government, military dictator, just walked in, took over, and drove the old government into exile. This was altogether too typical, and most of the coups were military. Some general who had command of the army would just move in, take over. Dictatorship was the norm. They would promise democracy, would say, when you people are ready for democracy, you can have it. They were promising democracy, they didn't get it. They were always under the threat of communism. The communists were there constantly, and the communists wound up making inroads into two countries. They were Cuba and Chile. Of course, the communists still have Cuba to this day. They got it in 1959. And two Castro brothers have ruled Cuba. Fidel Castro until 2008, when his health forced him out. From 2008, the president has been his younger brother, Raul, who has ruled Cuba from 2008 to the present. Two dictators. As for Chile, Chile has a distinction of being the only country in the world that ever democratically elected a communist government. The communist government only lasted a couple of years, and then it failed. And some people believe that the United States CIA was secretly involved in undermining the communistic government of Chile. This cannot be proven. I mean, I had a student from Chile once who said that we don't know that for sure, and I got to looking it up, and no, we cannot prove that our CIA actually moved in to try to destroy the government of Salvador. Allende was his name. Nevertheless, for a couple of years, Chile had a communist government. But anyway, these countries in Latin America have tended to be very poverty-stricken. And in the 1970s, the United States made some tremendously large loans to these countries. Loans that the United States knew could never be paid back, but we made them. And somehow the United States economy survived in spite of the fact that these countries all eventually defaulted and said, we're sorry, we can't pay them back. The United States more or less forgave the debts. Loans were made to Brazil, to Argentina, to Mexico. Now, your book then takes some of the bigger countries. Argentina. All right, Argentina has a unique case. Argentina was ruled for a long time by a man named Perón. Actually, it was ruled by two Peróns. There was Juan Perón and his wife. She did a lot of the running of the affairs of the country, and this is known. But she was very popular. Now, during the time that the Peróns were ruling Argentina, 30,000, well, your book said anywhere from 10 to 30,000 Argentinians just disappeared. We now know they were taken to a quiet place and executed and buried. Today we know where they were buried. We found their graves and dug up some of the graves. But basically, if you lived in Argentina this time, you might hear a neighbor of yours spout off about how lousy the government was. You'd hear it tonight. Get up tomorrow morning and the neighbor's gone, never to be seen again. A few days later, there might be another neighbor who might be spouting off about how lousy Perón was, and he's gone, never to be seen again. Some 30,000 people might have disappeared. And this brought down the wrath of a lot of the rest of the world who said Argentina is violating human rights. Eventually, the Perón couple passed on. Supposedly now these countries, including Argentina, have adopted something that resembles a democracy, and it appears that they are prospering more. Now, I think that one of the main reasons for their prosperity is that they have given their people a little bit more freedom. Now, one of you, I believe was in here, did a paper on the Mexican dictatorship of the early 1970s, how the Mexican dictator executed a whole lot of folk, but then he was eventually ousted, and Mexico, under pressure from the world, gave its people more freedom. But as its people have gotten more freedom, they have had more incentive to prosper, and these countries are, at least from what I understand, making some headway. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, they're doing a little bit better. Now, the one exception is Mexico. And again, if any of you are from Mexico, I mean, I never asked my students where they're from. No offense. I went to Mexico once in 1976. I do not believe I want to go back. They tell me that Mexico has no law and order. And the problem, folk, everybody knows the problem. The problem is the druggists, the poor people. But who's the biggest customer? Anybody know? Who's Mexico's biggest drug customer? The United States. In fact, the president of Colombia once said, if you people in America wouldn't consume so many drugs, we wouldn't have any problems here. But the problem is, Mexico is our closest neighbor, except for Canada, maybe. And they have a whole lot of lawlessness, with the drug people taking over, and the government seems to be powerless to stop them, because a lot of times the drug people are the government. And they secretly grow these drugs to sell the drugs, oftentimes illegally, to sell the drugs to the United States. Now, I must say this. I mean, I'm aware, very much aware, that the United States is starting the process of legalizing pot. This was going on when I was a kid. I mean, we'd watch movies about young kids would get together at a pot party, the police would bust it up, and the kids would chant, make marijuana legal, make marijuana legal. The marijuana, this is something that was in the term recently, the marijuana that's being distributed today is not the same marijuana we knew 50 years ago. They have found ways to get it, it's a different variety. The same plant, they send them the same plant, but a different variety. And it's a variety that's actually worse. Now, I mean, you can argue that marijuana is not addictive. And my reply is, my 16-year-old son, and I had a discussion about this, that is true for some people. But among humans, no two people have the same kind of body. Some of us could probably take marijuana and not hurt us, and others can take it. I mean, there was a man in Colorado who took it, went crazy, and jumped over a high building. Jumped to his death. This happened last week, the week before, one or the other. Now, it doesn't affect everybody that way. It doesn't affect, might not affect you that way. It might not affect me that way. I mean, I'm not about to find out. But it is known that stuff that's out there now does reduce a person's mental capacity and reduce his ability to think cognitively and to solve problems. All right, if any of you want to argue, I won't argue, I'll just listen. Anybody have, the floor is open. And nobody wants to say anything? This class participates more, by far more than some of the classes. Do you have any? It's a controversial topic, I know, but nevertheless, Mexico, big problems. All right. Society and culture in the Western world. The book talks about how that our society since World War II has been a society of consumerism. Generally, Western nations have been wealthier than people throughout history. The one thing I must say about that is it looks like the wealth that we have enjoyed may be somewhat diminishing. That the next generation, your generation, might not achieve as highly as far as wealth as previous generation Americans. And we have a whole lot of people in their 20s and early 30s, young people, still living at home with their parents, more so than we've had before in other generations.